Hi, everybody. My name is Clint Bowie. I'm the artistic director of the New Orleans Film Society, and I'd like to thank you all for being with us here today to view the film Kanaval from director Henri Pardo, and for engaging with us for this special Lagniappe discussion featuring licensed professional counselor Monica Kazis, who is joining us to add some important context to help us understand and unpack some of what we just viewed, specifically from a trauma-informed perspective. This is intended to supplement the viewing experience and is part of an ongoing film series presented with support from Science on Screen, an initiative of the Coolidge Corner Theater with major support from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. So Monica, thank you for being here. I'd like to turn it over to you and ask you to introduce yourself and say a little bit about your background.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So my name is Monica Kazis. I am a licensed professional counselor in the state of Louisiana. And I have a private practice located in New Orleans called Full Circle Counseling. I currently specialize in couples therapy and addiction recovery counseling. But prior to starting my own private practice, I spent years working in the inpatient substance abuse world, treating drug addiction and trauma. So I hope that my insight and brief psychoeducation in regard to some of the trauma that's portrayed in this film can provide some more understanding into the importance of mental health and also the support that we can provide for others.
Absolutely. That's why we wanted you here, just in part because of your experience with trauma and your experience and knowledge of this, specific phenomenon. In the film itself, which everyone's seen now, Rico, who's the young protagonist, witnesses domestic abuse against his mom within their home. And I want to start with a broad question for you regarding how a traumatic experience like this can negatively affect someone, especially a young person.
Yeah, so in the film, Rico is experiencing something called secondary trauma, which is a result from indirect exposure to trauma. And the stress often can result from helping or wanting to help a traumatized or suffering person. Although, potentially he's probably too young to kind of understand or really name his feelings in the moment when he's having this experience. I would imagine he was feeling fearful and shocked. And um, my thoughts are, I wonder if some of the feelings that might later show up for Rico as he ages and kind of grows up may manifest in some feelings of hopelessness or self-blame. I know it can be really painful to watch a loved one in pain and feel like you're not able to help or stop the situation. So, kind of similar to processes of grieving, this may be followed by some questions of what ifs, right? So, for example, if only I was able to do something in the moment, maybe mom wouldn't be so sad. Maybe we wouldn't have had to move here. Or if I was older or stronger to stop the abuse, maybe taking some blame on himself for not being able to protect his mom. I think a big part of the film also where, mom asks Rico to not leave the house, right? And he kind of does this anyway. So, kind of replaying maybe that moment prior to the trauma. So, if only I didn't leave the house when my mom asked me to, is this my fault? Right. So, I think it can be really easy for us to take on the blame and kind of question situations that maybe feel out of our control in order to try to grasp onto some sort of sense of false control.
Hmm. Hmm. Could you talk a little bit about how some of this might be different for someone who witnesses physical abuse, so secondary trauma, versus someone who's on the receiving end of that trauma?
Yeah, so kind of in addition to the secondary trauma, another thought that comes to my mind is that maybe Rico kind of growing up and living in some sort of like denial of how much one can really be impacted by secondary trauma. I feel like it's not something that's often really talked about, and there's just not a lot of attention on kind of the secondary piece. So I think it could be really easy for us to kind of look at others and compare our own trauma to theirs, just leaving us to minimize our own experiences as valid or not, needing to kind of seek that proper help. So for example, like maybe he might have some thoughts like, well, mom had it worse than me, so I need to be the person in the family to stay strong for her. just not really paying enough attention to his own experience. So this could also be easy to rationalize as the film depicts, the mom suffering in her silence through distancing herself from Rico through isolation, as opposed to having more conversations with him about the event that took place from a young age. So this could maybe teach him through the modeling of his mom's own behavior that maybe it's not okay to talk about it. And this would further the repression of his traumatic experience instead of maybe, creating a safe space for him to process his emotions appropriately. Which yeah.
Yeah. Um, I want to ask you a little bit about the biology of some of this. If you could walk us through some of the different ways in which our brains process trauma and how the brain itself is involved with this.
Yeah, so traumatic stress can be associated with certain lasting changes in different brain areas. So, kind of the big ones in neuroscience, the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. All of these certain brain areas support complex learning, memory, and decision making. So, experiencing trauma at a young age can often lead to post traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, as well as other co-occurring disorders. Some may be depression, substance use, dissociation, or just other mental health problems. And one of the most interesting things that I feel like I've learned as a mental health professional is that trauma is stored in the right side of our brain. And so, there's kind of two hemispheres of the brain. The right brain is very intuitive and creative, whereas the left brain is responsible for language and logic. So, because of this, there's like kind of a lot of new research out there that suggests that sometimes talk therapy, the traditional model of therapy, can sometimes can be a difficult method for always being able to process trauma when it's deeply stored in the back right hemisphere of our brain. So instead of using the left side with logic and language, therapists are now utilizing additional techniques that feel more creative. So things like art therapy can help like access the trauma that's stored in the right brain because you're using that creativity as a processing outlet. So I just think that's really interesting.
Yeah. Um, I have a question about care and support for those who have experienced trauma, and specifically for friends, family members, but also coworkers or anyone who spends time with someone who's experienced trauma. How can one show support for them and avoid re-traumatizing an individual who's already been traumatized?
Yeah, great question and a really important one. So, I mean, I think supporting someone through trauma can be really tricky. Um, some basic tips for someone wanting to support, is just through patience and listening and kind of giving them the time to share at their own pace and providing that safe space to do so by listening and empathy. And I think most importantly, like really believing their experience. Sometimes people experience trauma and they go to other people about it and they aren't believed, right? And they also sometimes in those moments can feel blamed. So I would say, validate their feelings and their experiences as true. Avoid blaming them. Only give advice if you're asked to. Being careful about, we all love to relate, but I would be careful about sharing our own related experience immediately because then it kind of becomes more about you as opposed to really being able to support them in their experience in that moment. So I like to say a trauma response is a normal response to an abnormal situation. So part of validating someone's experience, and what I mean by that is that whatever their trauma response is fine, right? It's their response that's okay. That's not the issue, right? And being able to validate that makes them feel less lonely in those situations. So, for example, if Rico responds by being angry, let him be angry, right? Join in sitting in those feelings with him rather than dismiss them or try to control them or change them or shame them. Especially for a child, right? So hearing about someone's trauma can be hard, but it's also important that if someone's willing to share, don't shy away from those moments. Often we're so uncomfortable with sitting in our own feelings that we kind of struggle to hold space for the feelings of others. And this can cause people to feel more alone in their trauma or their grief and shut down from wanting to really share and open up. So, really, my best tip, all you have to do is try to provide the space by just showing up, just listening, just being present, and not putting so much pressure on yourself to always know or have the right thing to say. It's not really about that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. As we saw in the film, Rico, creates an imaginary friend to help him adjust um, to being displaced from his hometown, to some of what he's experienced. Could you speak a little bit to how this might be the brain's way of handling such a big change for a young person?
Yeah, so the brain creates resources in the absence of resources. So what I mean by that is, in regards to the film, it sounds like Rico is reaching out to grab onto anything or anyone who can bring him a sense of safety and comfort and familiarity and normalcy, right? With these big adjustments he's moving through. So I think with his imaginary friend, he's in charge. He's in control of this relationship, right? He's choosing it. I also hear he's maybe feeling quite lonely with his mom's recent distancing from him post her traumatic experience. So unfortunately, when we're not able to communicate clearly and directly with our children, they may start to kind of fill in the blanks and create their own narratives. So, going back to this idea of maybe self blame for Rico and what he might experience as he gets older, I would be concerned that because mom is struggling to talk to him about their shared traumatic experience, he may be sensing her distance from him again as his fault or recreating kind of his own narrative around his mom's love and care for him.
Mm. And for for those parents, guardians, adults who are aware of a young person who's, has an imaginary friend, do you have any advice or recommendations for best ways to approach something like that?
Yeah, interesting question. I think children being creative in their imaginations is a positive thing. I mean, the more that we can acknowledge and kind of make space for kids to express this in any capacity, regardless of what it looks like, the less that part of them will need to exist in the future. So like it's beneficial to make space for it rather than silence it. Rico's imaginary friend is really just again about him being, feeling seen and heard and validated. And when a child is validated, the system their system will no longer need that part of them that they've created, right? Eventually. So really this feels like a great outlet for any adult to honestly be able to dive deeper into understanding Rico's world and his needs. And maybe by figuring out those needs that aren't being met or are being met by his imaginary friend, as a parent or a caregiver, right, you can then further meet those needs for him in real life because now you have more of a context in understanding them. So
Mhm. Mhm. That's all great. Thank you so much, Monica, for providing some of this additional understanding as a supplement to the film itself, and certainly helps have this kind of context bringing into the viewing. So really thank you and appreciate your time for being with us today.
yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it as well.
Absolutely. Well, we look forward to seeing everybody at our next event. Thanks again for coming. And again, thank you, Monica.
Thanks. Bye.